Welcome. We're just gonna give another minute or so for everyone to shuffle into the virtual room. But it's always great to know who's on the call and where everyone is joining us from. So, I just want to encourage you to use the chat and say hello. Tell us where you're joining us from. Tell us which traditional, who the Indigenous hosts of the land that you're joining us from are. As we get ready to listen to Graeme. Amazing. Bonjour, Leora. Hola, Julian. Hi, Rachel. Why don't we get started? So my name is Martha Stegman. I'm an assistant professor here at York in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. And on behalf of York's University Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages, I want to welcome you all to today's public lecture with Dr. Graeme Reid, which is entitled Indigenous Climate Futures, Alternative Visions for Nature-Based Solutions. So I'm joining you from York campus, which is located on the ancestral lands of the Huron-Wendat Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to recognize the web of interconnected historical treaties that orient us here in Toronto, and that are intended to structure relations between the Indigenous host nations of this territory and settler governments. And they're also intended to guide relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and with the land. So these include the Turo or the Goswenta wampum, which evolved into the Haudenosaunee British Covenant chain. This was extended to the 24 nations around the Great Lakes, including the Mississaugas and other Anishinaabeg nations at the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. I want to recognize the Dish with One Spoon wampum and Treaty 13, or the so-called Toronto Purchase. So for those of us who are concerned with the climate crisis, which I assume is everyone who's on this call, recognizing our treaty relationships and orienting ourselves towards the Indigenous legal traditions, governance, and knowledge systems that they are embedded within demands that we decolonize our understanding of the climate crisis, that we recognize it as a human crisis with roots in settler colonialism. So that calls on us to challenge settler colonial structures and center the voices and the leadership and the decolonial movements of Indigenous peoples, so that we can imagine and implement the kind of radical transformative changes that the IPCC is telling us that we must. So we're joined today by Dr. Graeme Reid, who's going to help us to understand and to get our minds and our hearts and our spirits around that challenge. So Dr. Reid is a senior policy advisor with the Assembly of First Nations, where he advocates for the inclusion of First Nations in the federal, provincial, and territorial climate change and energy policy dialogue. He has also recently completed his doctorate from the University of Guelph, studying the intersection of Indigenous governance, environmental governance, and the climate crisis. His thesis, which is entitled Indigenous Climate Futures, Developing Alternative Visions for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, explores how Indigenous solutions can generate self-determined futures in the face of catastrophic change. In addition to research, he's keenly involved in the mobilization of knowledge, including as coordinating lead author of the Indigenous Resilience Report in the National Climate Assessment, and as co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He is Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes, Wikwemikon unceded territory, with mixed ancestry from England, Scotland, and Germany. And he's also a postdoctoral fellow here at York, based at the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages. So the title of today's talk is Indigenous Climate Futures, Alternative Visions for Nature-Based Solutions. I want to encourage all of you, as you're listening to Graeme's words and you're listening to what he's sharing with us, that if questions come up, hold them for the Q&A at the end, but also use the chat and put them there so that we can refer to those when we open it up for discussion after Graeme's talk. And with that, Graeme, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, wicked. Chimigwich, Martha, and Chimigwich to everybody joining this virtual circle. So Anin Bojo, Graeme Rita Dishikaz, Aro Nonjaba, Makoto Dam, Anishinaabe, and Dao. Really honored to join you from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands currently, what's known as Vancouver. And I think the kind of acknowledgement of territory and land and how it's interconnected to the conversation that we're aspiring to have today is so important. And effectively, climate is a land problem, and I love the extension to climate as a people problem. And so through the course of this conversation with all of you, hopefully we can kind of get to that and why I chose to focus on this concept of nature-based solutions and what that means. It's funny. I think like by this time next week, I think I'll be officially doctor, crossing my fingers for everybody. My defense is actually on Monday. And so this is conveniently scheduled to help actually design and inform what I'm going to present in that space. So I carry lots of different hats, and I'll talk about those hats. You've heard a couple examples of those, but effectively, there are personal, professional, and academic obligations that I carry in this space, starting with also acknowledging who's helped me get here. The obvious first acknowledgement is my family, and I'll share that in an instant, but also want to acknowledge my supervisors for this doctoral work. Nick Brunet and Sherry Longboat are both professors at the University of Guelph. And then the esteemed scholar, Professor Deb McGregor, is also a member of my advisory committee and have had, a privilege of working both academically and professionally very closely with Deb over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. So I wanted to kind of do 3 things with all of you today: explore the context, both the context in which we're operating through this multiple intersecting and compounding crises, but then kind of explore the role of how nature-based solutions are being used to address potentially that crises, some of the problems associated with that, and then we'll share kind of effectively three chapters of my thesis, 3 standalone papers associated with that are done in conversation with Indigenous experts from across the country, and I'll explain that, and then really talk a little bit about the implications and future direction and that role of decolonization as it relates to the structural and ongoing legacy of settler colonialism is a key component of that, as well as the extractive tendencies of the economic system that we've seen to find ourselves in. But important, I think, first to acknowledge where I come from and how I'm entering this virtual circle. So I introduced myself briefly in the limited Anishinaabe, and then I know on my dad's side, I am English and Scottish. And you see in the top left corner there, us at a Red Blacks game in Ottawa. On my mom's side, I'm German and Anishinaabe. And right below the 2 of us wearing those hats is my nan, and my pop. My nan's family, her her father was born in Okumekong, and then her great-grandmother was born in Thessalon. Next to that is my wife, Layla. We also have a 4-legged dogter whose name is Atlas, who's about 6.5 now. And then under the Wiki Cultural Festival is my mom and I going down to the annual powwow. The other pictures there are different hats that I wear kind of professionally. And so right above the picture with my mom is a picture with 2 First Nations leaders that I was supporting at COP25 in Madrid. So that's Regional Chief Kalani Adamek from the Yukon and Grand Chief Willie Littlechild, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard of as one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. Across the table, you have Minister Wilkinson, who is then Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And, part of my role at the AFN is really supporting our political leadership to interface with our federal counterparts. Below the picture of Layla and I was the 2019 school strike, Global Fridays for Future climate march within Montreal, and we were privileged to, I know it's tough to see because it looks like a small picture, but privileged to stand behind the front of the parade or the march that had Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people, and then behind that we had First Nations leadership, both within Quebec but also across the country. You'll see that Greta's there in the front, and have had the privilege of interacting and meeting with Greta a couple times. On the far right is a little bit of a introduction to that international space, and as was shared, I've been co-chairing the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change for about 4 years now, and preparing very rapidly for COP27 coming up in Egypt in a couple of weeks. I also sit on one of the constituted bodies within that context. It's called, and this is jargon filled, it's called the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. So I'm the North American representative on that, the first constituted body that has Indigenous and state representation within the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then just below that is just another meeting with a colleague and friend of mine, Diane, and then obviously Justice Murray Sinclair. And so really, the intention of introducing myself in that way is just to acknowledge how I enter this circle and the multiple identities that I carry with me and essentially translate into the work that I do. And want to acknowledge also those identities that many of you carry with you, and acknowledge that, being a student or a researcher or a professor is one element of that. And I think it's important to open up space within these conversations to do that. I wanted to share a little bit about the problem, and I thought the introduction kind of summarizes. We're, facing all of these intersecting and compounding crises that are, defining and describing the way in which the world is going. And so we have, multiple climate reports, whether from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also biodiversity or ecosystem service-based reports, the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and obviously the translation of that into the Canadian context. And so this Canada's Changing Climate Report, which the Indigenous Resilience Report that we're working on is a sub-component of, essentially showed the way in which Canada is facing warming and the implications of that warming at double the global magnitude and triple the global magnitude in the Arctic. And so we know that these intersecting and compounding crises are important to acknowledge and understand the problem that we're aspiring to address. We also know, for instance, that despite our best efforts with the kind of health pandemic that we continue to face, that there are legacies and linkages to the way in which these crises face and we experience these crises, not to mention the kind of disproportionate impact that they have on, those structurally oppressed groups and the connection to the structural legacy of colonization. And so really important to acknowledge that. Also wanted just to share, the way in which Indigenous peoples think about and conceptualize this is important and different. And we've heard a little bit of those examples as to why it's different. These are just, pretty old now, but two headlines that really speak to the magnitude of the crises that we're facing. And, we have some leaders responding to the Canada in a Changing Climate Report, literally talking about life and death and the implications of that. And then up in Old Crow, the most northern First Nation in the Yukon, just sharing how, their community is warming at 3 times faster than the rest of the world. And what is the implication of that for how they adapt and or deal with the changing climate. A lot of these issues within mainstream media, among the wide plethora of other climate-related solutions, one tool has been this concept of nature-based solutions, and that's kind of how I'm entering this space. My intention was not to necessarily focus on this because I think it's the kind of best solution, but it is an interesting articulation of mainstream society's efforts to acknowledge those intersecting crises. And so nature-based solutions as a concept has been growing in the years, both academically, politically, and corporate, and really is intended to be an umbrella term that captures these solutions that at their core work with nature. And we know that sounds pretty good. Like, obviously we want to work with the natural world around us. And so the intention is also just uplifting, and why it's characterized as an umbrella term is that it's inclusive of these other concepts that have been around for decades: ecosystem-based adaptation, natural infrastructure, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, all of which are really central to highlighting the role in which nature plays, whatever nature is, and we'll get to that in developing solutions. Now, there are many different definitions that have been used to define what these solutions are. Most commonly is one by the IUCN that really talks about these actions that sustainably manage, restore natural or modified ecosystems that address these societal challenges effectively and adaptively. And the intention there is really an acknowledgement that these societal challenges often connect to things like the climate crisis or biodiversity collapse. And really, irrespective of the specific definition, the components are about the role of nature, the ability of these co-benefits that it characterizes as these human well-being and biodiversity, and also the connections to humans and well-being. In the Canadian context, we've heard a lot of language, especially in recent years, about the role that they can play in providing significant and cost-effective contributions to global emissions reduction. And so there's this kind of emerging belief that these concepts can do that, can contribute to holding our warming under 2 degrees, which we know is the target. Now, there are a lot of challenges to that. And so, if we think about what are nature-based problems, first we potentially think about how nature-based solutions are embedded within a broader conversation about climate change and the root causes of climate change. And often when we speak to our elders or our knowledge holders, we know that climate change is not just a technical or scientific issue. It's really a story about relationality between humans and the planet, and the responsibility that humans have in walking in good relations with the world around them. And effectively, as Martha shared, being a problem of human values. And those human values influence human behaviors, which influence these outcomes that we're now seeing now, whether it's biodiversity collapse or climate change, et cetera. But effectively, we need to address that root cause of imbalance that we engage in the world around us. As we transition that kind of broad umbrella of climate change, the literature on these concepts of nature-based solutions has had really limited engagement with Indigenous peoples, our rights, our worldviews, our governance. And the implication is, maybe we're not arriving to how we define and characterize nature in the same way. What are the ontological assumptions that we carry with us when considering these from these different positionalities? And so, part of the work that I was trying to do with this thesis is really kind of explore for the first time what that looks like from our perspective. And part of the motivation of that really came from some work that we had done in 2020. I think it was a summit hosted by Nature Canada about nature-based solutions. And as part of that, there was a small contingent of Indigenous peoples that released a statement that we had, on the record in the gathering, and really articulated some of the concerns that not only the literature has, but also that Indigenous peoples have with the concept of nature-based solutions. And so effectively, those knowledge holders and those Indigenous representatives identified that the current framing continues to conceptualize humans as separate from nature, commodify it in terms of balance sheets and offsets, and view the land and water as void, of peoples and open for development. And, really kind of went on to talk about the need to call for a complete rethink about how we engage with this concept, how we engage with the way in which mainstream discourse is uplifting it as a solution to these intersecting and compounding crises. And so that's really kind of the context in which the work that I want to share with you all today sits. And really that question is, if there is a limited understanding and engagement with Indigenous peoples within this solutions, like what are Indigenous peoples' visions for nature-based solutions? And obviously this is not an intention to homogenize Indigenous peoples into one kind of specific vision, but really just start to articulate what are the sets of principles and considerations when we're interfacing with these kind of mainstream concepts, and how do we do that? And so the way in which we kind of structured this through is first, like, let's build an understanding of federal conceptions of nature-based solutions. And I'll talk about how we did this, but really this is kind of a bit more of a policy review. How did it emerge within federal discourse? When did it emerge? What are the sorts of things that are being considered or not considered? And then really shifting gears to essentially working with our Indigenous experts. There was about 17 that participated in the study. And in having those conversations with folks, we kind of realized that, there are two stages to this review. First, we need to spend a bit of time on how Indigenous peoples actually conceptualize the nature and nature-based solutions, and what that means for how we think about what these solutions are or aren't, and then how do they relate to the ways in which we consider the drivers for the biodiversity and climate crisis. And so there's a paper and a chapter specifically on that, and I'll talk about that. And then based on that, through those interviews and through the discussions that I had with all these experts, there was a recognition that we're not going to propose a definition for Indigenous nature-based solutions. That's not the point of my work, and it's not the point of anybody's work. It's really, what are the sets of principles that help advance Indigenous peoples' approaches to nature-based solutions, and how do we create that space for ceremony so Indigenous peoples can enter themselves should they choose to. And so those are the broad three components of the work that I want to share. The way in which we framed it is really based in Indigenous ways of doing and research paradigms, and the way in which kind of dominant society brings these assumptions into colonial systems of whether it's climate policy or nature-based solutions. And my work is to try to unpack that a little bit. And part of the way that I do that is through kind of this broad intellectual foundation. And I know this is a little bit small, but generally speaking, and I've applied this in a climate research context, but we can open this up for many other kind of concepts or approaches. Our frameworks of decision-making, Indigenous frameworks of decision-making, are essentially forced to fit within the box of what, in this context, Canadian climate policy is. We could extend that to environmental governance. We could extend that to knowledge system co-production. We're essentially requiring the depth and complexity and diversity of Indigenous knowledge systems to fit within a process that's not ours. And so really the intention for kind of broadly my work and the way in which, I kind of approach and acknowledge this is that, our process of integration needs to be addressed. And in the opening remarks, Martha shared, the recognition and acknowledgement of the Truro Wampum. How are we, creating frameworks of thinking, whether at the micro scale in terms of, systems of knowledge integration, at the kind of, meso scale, environmental governance frameworks, or at the kind of micro or macro scale, these different ways of thinking and doing in their own parallel and respective processes without, with peaceful kind of continuation, without any sort of forcing or interfering with the other side. And so really this approach, this decolonial approach is intended to identify the process that Indigenous peoples have. And that process is obviously dependent on where you're from and which nation you are, and your decision-making process and your governance process. We know that governance is inherently tied to the land and your relationship with that, and the Canadian climate process, and what are those spaces for cross deliberation and cross communication. And so, I share this because this is, broadly how I think about this, and part of the work that I hope to aspire to do through these pieces of paper that I'm going to share with you is really kind of recentering that distinguishment between those two respective processes, and then figuring out how do we create that ethical space for that collaboration. And also want to acknowledge that, a lot of this thinking came from a lot of different conversations that I've had with different folks, including like Spencer Greening. Willie Ermine is the one who, worked on ethical space. Many of you may know, like Elder Dr. Reg Crochew, Danica Littlechild, and Sarah Mainville, all of which have been kind of integral in thinking about and framing this out in a more deliberate way. And so maybe I'll start with the kind of first, overview. And again, this is intended really to kind of deconstruct how the federal government conceptualizes or thinks about NbS. And so this paper is actually published already. So if you're interested in it, it's in Climate Policy. But really the intention was to identify these federal climate policy documents. There were 9 in total, and then essentially review them through this lens that I've been working on in a few different scenarios that kind of characterizes a sustainable self-determination lens. Sustainable self-determination is a concept by a scholar out here, Jeff Corntassel, and really kind of emerged from these criticisms of the rights discourse. And so through that criticism of the rights discourse, acknowledged 2 things. One, that essentially our decisions need to be sustainable, and we can talk about what, sustainable in that context means, but we also need to acknowledge these kind of 4 problems within the discourse. Like the first is really about, separating land and resources from assertions of self-determination. And so we have jurisdiction, the restriction of participation of Indigenous peoples within decolonization. And so we have full and effective participation, the reduction of Indigenous peoples as just minority populations and stakeholders. So we have Indigenous rights, and then effectively, our cultural responsibilities and relationships. And so we have our knowledge systems. And so the intention of kind of shaping that into a policy lens enabled us to consider whether or not Canada was advancing this concept of sustainable self-determination. The second question that came out of this is, whether or not nature-based solutions within, or how did nature-based solutions within Canadian climate policy emerged? And so based on that, that's the kind of broad citation we have here. So essentially, looking at this graph, a little bit confusing. These are the 9 different documents that we reviewed. In each of them, we essentially counted the number of references to nature-based solutions compared to other natural or nature-related comments, just to effectively show how it emerged over time. And so we see that, it's really started to grow, and that black part there has started to grow recently when Canada is starting to use this concept within its federal discourse. It's now, as I shared in the opening slides, it's now actually saying that this solution, this nature-based solution, is going to contribute to our mitigation efforts to keep warming under 1.5 or under 2 degrees. But it's effectively quite recent, 3 years ago, largely from international forces, the Global Committee on Adaptation, and then kind of emerged into, federal like liberal electoral promises, and then blah blah blah, kind of emerged into the discourse. On the sustainable self-determination lens, we essentially did the same sort of thing, unpacked each of these documents and looked at, we built a matrix around those four concepts: Indigenous knowledge systems, jurisdiction, rights, and full and effective participation, and kind of characterized what it looks like, and then essentially talked about the results. And so there is, through the course of these 9 documents, a growing recognition of the role of Indigenous rights, the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems, and even that language has emerged over the last 6 years, from traditional knowledge to Indigenous knowledge to Indigenous knowledge systems. And part of that has been just the conversations that we've been having at the AFN and the ITK and MNC on how we think about the complexity and depth of thought within our knowledge systems, and how that's not just data. And then really the ongoing commitment to Indigenous participation, which has been growing over time, and the recognition has been growing. The challenge is that there's a clear unwillingness to recognize Indigenous jurisdiction and understandings of land. And the implication of that is that even though, we're growing in these areas of rights and knowledge systems and participation, we're not engaging with the foundational issue that is effectively land-based, which obviously nature-based solutions stem from. And so without engaging in that, jurisdictional conversation, we're kind of missing the point. We're missing the base of the relationship that we have with Canada, and the base of the relationship that has with provinces and territories, and the assumed sovereignty of those provinces and territories. And then there's also, whether it's an unwillingness or an inability to engage deeply with Indigenous understandings of land and the complexity and nature of that. And so, the implication of these elements that we shared in this paper was intended to, not only just expose what's happening within the federal space, but start to think about, what are the lessons and approaches that we can take for, considering Indigenous peoples within nature-based solutions, in particular how the feds consider it. And so there's obviously the role of Indigenous knowledge systems, including how we conceptualize our relationship with the land and water, and how that informs the development of solutions. I had an elder once tell me that, if we think about nature as an extension to ourselves, then all of our solutions are nature-based. And so there is this kind of difference between, how Canada considers it and how Indigenous peoples consider it. The acknowledgement and connection to Indigenous peoples as nations, the required jurisdictional recognition and engagement that needs to occur before we start talking about, climate or nature-based solutions. We really need to address that nationhood element. And then also just that these things are embedded within this system of, settler Indigenous relations, in particular the structural legacy of colonization and the ongoing legacy of capitalism and the implication of that. And so really the intention of this paper was to then, start to kind of carve out space for the second paper, which was about, okay, so we have the way in which our federal counterparts think about nature-based solutions. How do, as a group of Indigenous experts think about it? And so this paper is really about exploring Indigenous conceptualizations of nature and nature-based solutions in the joint biodiversity and climate crisis. You'll see that the title of this is, effectively there's no word for nature in our language. And the intention, and I'll get to some of the quotes, is really just to unpack it from that, because of the implications and path dependency associated with, how we define nature and how that influences nature-based solutions. This work was the start of the 2 chapters that was really based on conversations with Indigenous leaders and experts across the country. We had young people, women, technicians, knowledge holders, academics, all of which were actually identified in collaboration with the AFN. So all of this was actually done in kind of a research partnership with the AFN, which obviously relates directly to my day job. And so, we see the kind of diversity of Indigenous voices. We had the majority First Nations, 1 Inuk and 1 Métis scholar as well who participated, actually 2. And really it was, intended to broadly have conversations on what nature-based solutions are, how do we think about Indigenous-led solutions, what are the ways in which you perceive the difference between how you would consider nature-based solutions and how the federal government would. And then based on that, we decided that there were going to be, two broad parts of this paper. The first being that there has to be a discussion of the main drivers of these biodiversity and climate crisis, because that essentially frames the context in which nature-based solutions sit and our conceptualizations of nature within NbS sit. And so those three drivers, I think, align very closely with the things that I shared. There's a structural legacy of colonization and capitalism. There's a problem of human values. We need to rebalance our relationship with the land around us. And that climate is not a problem in itself. Climate change is actually a cumulative impact of industrial disturbances since settler contact, and we had like different examples of what that looks like in practice. So the reality that the climate problem can't be separated from the kind of industrial development and extractive economy that has been created and founded what we currently call as Canada. So those were intended to really just provide the broad context of where in which these conceptualizations sit. And I thought it would be useful to kind of broadly share the kind of 4 areas that our experts responded to, each by sharing a quote from one of them. And this is obviously in a little bit more depth in the paper itself. But essentially, broadly speaking, the first finding is that there are not a lot of words within our languages that describe nature. The concept within English, because it's noun-based, it actually perpetuates this separation between humans and nature. And that separation between humans and nature is juxtaposed between the way in which Indigenous ways of knowing and being see the connection between human spirit, land, and water. And so this kind of Spencer, and just to say, the way in which we approach this is that we ask like each interviewee or expert how they wanted to be identified in the paper. And so all of this is confirmed by them, and that's why I'm sharing their name with you. But really, Spencer was saying, there isn't a word for it in a lot of our languages. So in Indigenous sense, nature is just our place, our home, where we belong to, and you wouldn't really need to define it in that way. And Canadian or Western, we've been able to define it because we've othered it. And it kind of acknowledges that near non-existence of the term nature within our languages. We had, for example, like experts share like Aki in Anishinaabemowin is kind of the concept, but not really the way in which it separates or that it's separate from Indigenous peoples. The second broad finding continues that is that our systems of knowledge really counter that separation through the acknowledgement of the inseparability of ourselves, of the land, and of water. And so Quinn shared, what is nature? It's not a thing, it's not a noun. If you break it down linguistically, it's not a noun. It's more than what captures nature. It's the things that are connected, everything that's interconnected. And he goes on to describe the ways in which we're connected to the land and the natural world around us. We also shared the concept of humility and the responsibility that Indigenous peoples, or in this context, First Nations, carry to that natural world or the land around us. And part of the way in which we need to acknowledge the implication of that separation and that instrumentalization, essentially meaning that nature is there to provide for humans, as opposed to, we have equal responsibilities to our more than human relatives, was this concept of humility and responsibility. And so Becky, described how we're only a small part of creation, and we don't really have the control that we think. And so we need to repair our relationship. We need to bring back respect and reciprocity and stop exploiting and take only what we need. And that sense of obligation to carry out those, responsibilities was a central tenet to how do we address that disconnection or that disbalance or that imbalance that our experts, our elders, and our knowledge keepers have identified. On the final kind of broad finding is the revitalization of knowledge systems, the role of revitalizing these knowledge systems, both with respect to, how do we address the structural legacy of colonization and the implication of that, as well as how do we use our knowledge systems to conceptualize what nature-based solutions is and what's the process of engagement with these knowledge systems through decision-making, conceptual thinking, and implementation. And so Lisa, shared a little bit about what they are. It's not just this philosophical perspective based on these years and years and centuries of knowledge that we gain through our own science. The difference is the value system that we have in terms of our responsibilities to the land and our relationship with the land. And that's the key part that she had identified, as the part that needs to be worked on. And so, essentially the shift towards Indigenous conceptualizations of NbS as these systems of reciprocal relations had those four elements that our experts shared. This dichotomization, challenging that dichotomization, ensuring the inseparability of Indigenous peoples' land and water, internalizing these principles in politics of humility and our responsibility as humans, and then really supporting and uplifting the revitalization of Indigenous knowledge systems, and how that then translates into what policy implications there are. And obviously a first is centering, whether it's colonization or decolonization as an interpretive framework for understanding nature-based solutions. How are they connected to the way in which we've designed our frameworks of decision-making around the land and water? And only through acknowledging and using this as an interpretive framework can we acknowledge some of the harms that nature-based solutions may cause, and full by extension to climate policy writ large. How do we uphold and ensure Indigenous self-determination and participation within decision-making? How do we create and engage in these frameworks of braiding ontologies and epistemologies for the transformative nature-based solutions? And then how do we open up space for Indigenous-led nature-based solutions? And that opening up that space is really the intention of this final paper. And I know I've been talking for a long time, so I'll try to go relatively quickly through some of this. But the intention of this paper is really kind of picking up on that concept of opening up space. When we engaged in these conversations with all of these knowledge holders or all these experts, like it became evident that we couldn't just provide a definition. No one Indigenous person or First Nation is the same. And so how do we develop the set of principles that begin to map out what that space for ceremony is for implementing nature-based solutions within their lands, waters, and territories, but also how do we consider climate policy? This was the second paper used with those conversational interviews with these leaders and experts, and really intended to build on that momentum by reviewing these existing sets of principles for nature-based solutions. There are a wide variety of them. One of them is called the Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. There are others on urban environments, on planning environments, on societal benefit, all of which really have limited engagement with Indigenous peoples. The exception being one that talks about the role of how engagement and consent with Indigenous peoples needs to be a part of it. And so based on this kind of clear lack of principles that are acknowledging and uplifting Indigenous systems of knowledge, we effectively identified 7 principles that begin to articulate the way in which we shift towards that reconceptualization of NbS as an extension to those reciprocal relationships. So we have one about the role of embracing humility and the challenge against kind of human exceptionalism and the mode of thinking that is informed and created these systems of domination and exploitation. And part of engaging and embracing humility is to confront that reality and start to acknowledge where we are within our webs of relations and the responsibility that we have. We shared about expressing relationality. I think many of you probably understand the role of upholding rights and responsibilities within all elements of that. Some of the experts talked about rights and responsibilities being two sides of one coin. The role of embedding spirituality within our decision making, and I'll share a quote associated with that. Supporting reconnection, that reconnection back to our languages, our culture, our history, many of which has been disrupted by colonization. The importance of incorporating interconnectivity within our decision-making frameworks, effectively challenging that notion that humans and nature are separate, and the siloed-based thinking that we deal with on a daily basis. And then finally, ensuring Indigenous leadership. I'm not going to share quotes for all 7 of these, but I decided just to share kind of 4 of them that I thought, kind of continue the story from the 4 that was shared in the last paper. And the first was about this relationality and the role that relationships and relationality play in understanding and addressing those root causes being those 3 drivers that were identified in the earlier paper, whether it's that structural legacy of colonization, the problem of human values, the cumulative impact. And, key to that is the recognition from Ariel is that we have responsibilities to the land as well, and all of your relationships on the land, and that you need to have that balance. And there was quite kind of a unanimous call that the part of the original nature-based solutions is to stop the immediate further harm to the land. Like, how are we upholding our responsibility through this? And so that was quite significant through all of the conversations that we had. On reconnection, they talked about the importance of identity and language, and the rediscovery and re-engagement with our languages, our identity, our practices. And Chief Lewis talked about, NbS for us is really about not forgetting who we are, what we are, and what we stand for. And that is being passed on to the next generation, and that these teachings need to be taught, protected, and nurtured. Kind of a key articulation of that. They spoke about the continuation of that inseparability between land, Indigenous peoples, and water is that extension to how are we embedding that within our knowledge systems and our systems of decision making. And so Kyle, provided a really interesting example of the way in which, economic valuations aren't the way in which Indigenous peoples think about these issues. And so he shared that, it's been calculated that a fish requires these 3 cubic feet of water to survive. But we know that in water, fish need a stream, they need an ecosystem, and they need other animals within that ecosystem. And so he shared that the interconnectedness or the connectedness of all of these elements is the part that Indigenous peoples will bring. And that's the lens, and that's the table that we're missing. The final one that I'm sharing with you, and obviously there are 7, so this notion of embedding spirituality really acknowledges that relationship, or that recognition, that all beings, the land, water, animals, plants, medicines, rocks, have spirit. And effectively, we hold responsibilities to ensure their protection, and that the neglect to that protection is actually leading to that world of imbalance. And so this Cree legal scholar essentially believes that leaving spirit out of these conversations has significant ramifications. And it actually, as a result, leads to this barrier of having blue sky thinking about being one with nature, nature-based solutions from actually being impactful and effective. And so, just to kind of summarize, we had the first set of these principles. We identified those 7 principles and the opportunities for those principles to essentially create space for Indigenous peoples to express their own nature-based solutions based on their culture, history, and governance. And then again, like talked about and continued the trajectory and momentum around what are the implications for their implementation. And we know that dichotomization and instrumentalization of nature is a key problem, and key through the course of all that was shared today is important to end. This relational framework, this system of reciprocal relations is key to how do we think about and interpret and implement these nature-based solutions. And then how do we, uphold Indigenous self-determination within research, implementation, and decision-making? And, all three of those, implications have specific principles that kind of speak to them and inform why we're characterizing them in such a way. Now, I bet, you're wondering, like, what are these examples? And so one of the examples that one of the experts shared was this notion of clam gardens. And the clam gardens cultivated by, in particular, coastal First Nations, and the role in which, that cultivation actually created abundance, not only for the effective harvesting of clams, but also the ecosystem around that. And so in that paper, there's a little bit of a description as to how, if we think about, these 7 principles, how do we apply them within the concept of clam gardens? We also heard many other examples: Indigenous protected and conserved areas, like language and culture camps. We heard about forestry initiatives, all of which are these articulations of what nature-based solutions are. And so just to kind of conclude broadly, you want to share some kind of implications for future research. And obviously this is the, broadly the thesis and the work that continuing to do is really the first detailed academic review of nature-based solutions. And these kind of, 3 recommendations are consistent with the implications that were discussed in the 3 other chapters. So, how are we centering this as an interpretive lens? Colonization in particular, or decolonization for the design, planning, and implementation? How do we effectively engage with Indigenous conceptualizations of land and water to avoid this dichotomization and instrumentalization? And then how do we ensure that the design, planning, and implementation of NbS must uphold these rights and responsibilities, including their rights of self-determination? And then what are the implications for future practice? And this is the space where, I think when talking about kind of broader climate discourse and lots of other concepts within, climate discussions, we often overlook. And so this notion of reflexively unpacking these assumptions implicit within these certain words. And nature is one example of them. Net zero is another really good example of that. What are the ontological assumptions that we're carrying into that conversation? Not to say that, those don't exist and those aren't, a history of our recognition of our history and our positionality, et cetera. But how do we enter the conversation in a way that everybody understands those assumptions in the context of nature-based solutions? If you conceptualize nature as being intimately tied to who you are and your identity, those solutions may be different than if you see nature as separate from the land around us and separate from ourselves. We also obviously about how do we support Indigenous-led climate and biodiversity research, the role of that, the ongoing work to support Indigenous peoples in unpacking these inadequacies and these assumptions within these dominant systems to open up space for that just, resilient, and equitable future for our little ones. And then really, how are we supporting, Indigenous peoples within the design, implementation, and communication of these studies? And so maybe just to conclude, and this is a bit of a pitch, because obviously joining York and would be keen to kind of continue and work with all of you in the room if you're interested. The ongoing work that I have planned is about kind of furthering these discussions, including honoring the in-depth conversations that I had with all of these experts, and really thinking about how does that tie into ongoing knowledge mobilization, whether or not that's through written means or others. The work and the connection directly to the AFN and the role that I have the AFN is really how do we use this policy lens, and maybe it's not the sustainable self-determination lens. We're also working at the AFN on a First Nations climate lens, but how do we use these concepts to advance Indigenous-led policy and governance, including from point of like really unpacking the ways in which dominant and mainstream approach these issues, and then really like how do we partner with First Nations and Indigenous peoples to test and strengthen these 7 principles. Like I know that obviously there are other considerations that are important and really kind of laying space for that. So, with that, I just, kind of broadly summarize the 3 pieces. I think I've been talking for long enough, but Chimigwech to everybody, and really look forward to the conversation that we're going to have.
Chimigwech for that, Graeme. That was just such an excellent talk. Thank you for breaking down the concept of nature-based solutions for us, for talking about, helping us to understand the ways that concept itself illustrates the ontological divide between Indigenous worldviews and knowledge systems and settler colonial ones, and for sharing with us this kind of framework of principles for what Indigenous understandings of nature-based solutions might be, and how we might begin to think about, operationalizing that in some kind of way in the context of decolonization. I want to open the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question for Graeme, I encourage you to either drop it in the chat or to raise your hand and you can articulate it yourself. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Well, I can get things started a little bit. Graeme, you and I were talking a little bit before the conversation started about your role as co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And you've talked to us about this concept of nature-based solutions, this critique of it, this sort of framework for Indigenous, visions for solutions moving forward. I would love to hear you talk about how the rubber hits the road in the quote unquote real world and in these policy forums, so to speak. And I mean, if you could really just, tell us about this, about the forum, about, what it is, what its role is, what it's achieved, what its challenges are, perhaps with nature-based solutions in mind as an example.
Yeah, for sure. And appreciate that. Like, first, I'll just say the kind of most recent numbers for Indigenous peoples across the globe is around 495 million, something in that area, separated into about 96 or 97 countries. And so the way in which we operate, so the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change is effectively one of 9 constituencies within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Constituencies are kind of groups of non-party stakeholders. So within the UNFCCC, there are parties, and then everybody else is non-parties. And so Indigenous peoples within that space are considered non-parties. And so there's 9 different constituency groups within there, things like women and gender, youth, environmental NGOs, trade unions, business, research institutions, blah, blah, blah. And so we've been kind of organized as a constituency since the early 2000s, and as the IIPSCC, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, since 2008. And, really are the kind of convening body for Indigenous peoples who participate in that process. The way that we organize ourselves is through these 7 UN sociocultural regions. There's like North America, Latin American, Caribbean, Arctic, Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Russia. And then those 7 regions effectively bring Indigenous peoples from their regions. And, our work is to support and amplify their voices. I think it's interesting, just to start to your point, like the UN, like in particular, well, I'll comment on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, but more broadly, the UN is not a space for Indigenous peoples, right? It's literally predicated on the erasure of Indigenous peoples. Like the whole notion is that it's upholding and advancing you know, party sovereignty, political sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And so there's like an inherent conflict between the way in which Indigenous peoples conceptualize themselves as nations with responsibilities and authority over their lands, and that recognition depends very much on the specific country, right? But how that manifests in, you know, the upholding of the nation state, the kind of Westphalian nation state within the UN Framework Convention. So, you know, there's kind of an inherent tension between the way in which we frame ourselves and think about ourselves and how we show up within these spaces. But despite that, you know, I think we've made some pretty significant gains, and the like main gain that that I think you know, that we received was actually in the Paris Agreement, where there is kind of explicit recognition for the rights of Indigenous peoples. So within the preambular language, there was I think it was preambular paragraph 11, and it's kind of embarrassing that I know that. There is kind of a you know, broad category of all the different obligations that parties have, including to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And since that, you know, we've gained a lot of success in terms of like amplifying the, you know, unique role that Indigenous peoples have within the UNFCCC, and that's led to the creation of that body that I sit on, the Facilitative Working Group, which is the first constituted body within the UN framework that has, you know, 7 Indigenous representatives representing the 7 UN sociocultural regions and 7 state representatives. It's also the first body, including, you know, compared to the permanent forum, compared to the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, that our regional processes nominate our representatives without having to go through, you know, the president of ECOSOC or whatever. And so it's kind of an advancement in terms of the recognition of self-determination. And so there are these like constructive, you know, steps forward in the ways in which Indigenous peoples take space within that. The way in which kind of dominant discourse conceptualizes all these issues is exactly the same in terms of the problems that were identified here. Like, you know, we're offering these kind of alternative visions to what are things like nature-based solutions, what are things like net zero, what are things like even like that binary between mitigation or adaptation, and what are the ways in which that binary or that dichotomization doesn't capture the complexity of Indigenous-led climate solutions, all of which are you know, really challenging within that space. But I think what's you know, really beneficial for it is the way in which we create our networks of solidarity with like Indigenous relatives across the country, across the world, and you know, how that then enables us to understand and push forward for solutions on the ground, because effectively that interface between what's happening at the UNFCCC and what's happening in our lands and waters needs to be clear, but effectively they're often disconnected. And so that I think is a short way to answer that. Do you want me to? I can call on Carlos and then Melissa.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah. Cheers.
First of all, thank you so much, Graeme, for your presentation. I think you will totally rock your dissertation defense next week. It's amazing to see your project. And my name is Carlos. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Dalhousie School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And I actually saw many parallels between the work you did and the work that I aspire to do through my doctoral work. For example, I want to look at the ontological assumptions of selected frameworks that exist in ecological public health education, and how Western or modern assumptions about reality and knowledge get socialized through education without really considering some of the contradictions that those ontologies have in terms of indigenous ontologies or other non-modern ontologies. And I also come from Mexico, so part of the work that I want to do is also look at the case of mestizo communities in Mexico, in which modernity and indigeneity are not so clearly distinguishable from each other, and see what kind of ontological assumptions are enacted in that way. So I'm just really excited to hear about your work, and I look forward to reading your published paper and the future papers that you write. And I guess my question to you would be more on the philosophical side and on the ethical space side, because as you mentioned, this partition between humans and nature is so deeply entrenched into modern Western science that it's a binary that it's very difficult to challenge, and it's also a binary that connects between the binary of the human and the other. That the superiority of the human or of the white European is based on the constructed inferiority of the other. And so, how do you see? Could you tell us more about how do you see your work contributing to building that ethical space? And yeah, just anything that you would like to say more about how your work contributes to establishing that ethical space. Thank you so much.
Yeah, wicked. Miigwech, Carlos, and it sounds like a really, really awesome kind of PhD work. So appreciate you sharing. And it is funny, like the ways in which we need to unpack reflexively our assumptions leading into these conversations, and the inability to kind of figure out how to do that like on a widespread base. And so ethical space, I mean, there are also, like, I want to acknowledge other frameworks of doing this, like the kind of frameworks like two-eyed seeing, like walking on two legs, multiple knowledge evident or multiple evidence-based, two-way thinking or PsyQ. Like there's all these different kind of models, at least in like a Canadian context, that Indigenous peoples and in particular First Nations are putting forth to essentially open up that space for how we engage in respectful dialogue based on those assumptions. And the work through ethical space is really, so maybe I'll use this as a non-academic example. Like one of the kind of main files that I have at the AFN is something that we call the Joint Committee on Climate Action. Essentially, there's a really bad engagement process with First Nations in the creation of Canada's first climate plan, the Pan-Canadian Framework. We created this body that has federal representatives and Indigenous representatives, First Nations representatives from 10 regions and about 7 to 9 departments. And after the first year of like not really, making much progress, we realized that part of the issue is that we're not entering this conversation as our full selves, because we don't really understand the responsibilities, obligations, and mandates that each of us carry. And so we engaged in essentially the creation of our own kind of principles of ethical space, which enabled us to kind of create the parameters around the relationship that we wanted to create to facilitate that kind of effective knowledge exchange. And so it wasn't necessarily like about, the knowledge itself and like, sharing First Nations worldviews. It was effectively about creating the space so that we acknowledge the legitimacy, credibility, and authenticity of those viewpoints, and then figure out how we as a collective engage in. And I'll try to find those principles, because I think they're like useful just to think about how we engage and create that space practically, because we can kind of talk about it in a lot of detail, but it's a lot harder, right, when we're talking about real human beings and the experiences that they have. But the ways in which we do this practically, it's also been done. And as I'm, stalling for time, it's also been done in the context of conservation. And you may have seen the Indigenous Circle of Experts. The Indigenous Circle of Experts advancing the concept of Indigenous protected and conserved areas kind of laid this framework for ethical space on how they think that there are these components that frame the ethical space, and then you enter that based on that shared understanding. And that then could be applied to different concepts or different situations, different interactions, different relationships. On the one comment, and I'll go to Melissa, and then I'll come back to share those principles with you as I'm listening to Melissa. But I think that kind of concept of indigeneity and modernity is really interesting, just because I think it reflects the nature that our cultures continue evolve. And it's like that challenge often in like these systems is, the ways in which, mainstream society wants to perceive indigeneity and the way in which Indigenous peoples perceive that and act on it. And, it's really, I think it would be really interesting to kind of unpack that both from an Indigenous perspective and the ways in which they express that modernity with, all of the different influences, but also the ways in which we indirectly categorize what indigeneity can and can't be, especially as it relates to, in my context, in the climate conversation. Indigenous peoples are those closest to the land, right? And it legitimizes that kind of vision of that kind of noble savage who, and then that's the way that sometimes it manifests within these spaces. Well, we know that we have Indigenous scientists and Indigenous experts and Indigenous doctors that are literally on this virtual circle currently. And so I think that's really interesting. Maybe I'll go to you, Melissa, and then I'll come back to Carlos.
Awesome, thank you.
Of course, yeah, that's great. I really appreciate you being here and all of your words and talk, especially with all the energy gearing up for the COP. I was really excited for this. It seems very timely. And I'm not sure in what context you will know this or if you have heard anything, but I have just seen and heard a lot about how there is going to be a very strong security presence at this year's COP, at COP27. And obviously that has been the case in the past, but it seems especially heightened this year. And as we sadly know, then armed law enforcement does not usually create a safe space for Indigenous leadership to come and share and advocate. And I was wondering if you had heard other people's takes, especially who are Indigenous, how they are hoping to show up in a safe manner, or if you predict that there could be an uptick or a downtick of an Indigenous presence at COP this year because of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like definitely the way in which like we're preparing and communicating is like that this is a completely different environment. And that, our land and water defenders need to be attentive to that, especially those that show up for like, essentially direct action outside of the venue. For others, there's the venue that's controlled by the UNFCCC called the Blue Zone. Often there's a lot of people who participate in direct action outside. And Melissa, the way that you're nodding tells me you know that, but maybe others don't. And so like often, we have big delegations attend, part are doing the outside kind of campaign work and part are doing the inside. I think there's a lot less of kind of outside work this time, and there's a lot more aversion to not only the ways in we show up, but how we communicate the situation for, Egyptian human rights defenders or otherwise, and the way in which, we need to acknowledge that, we'll leave after 3 weeks, but many of these folks are dealing with an extremely repressive regime in perpetuity. We're just on the like Indigenous side, like we've been working with, I think it's called the Global Legal Defense Fund or something, to prepare like essentially a preparatory webinar on like what are the ways in which we can avoid legal peril and how can we, support Indigenous peoples, against any sort of problems that may arise. And so definitely kind of front and center to the work that we're trying to do. I don't think last time I checked on like the number of people that I think are attending, at least from the Indigenous side, is probably about 130 to 150, which for us is a decent number. Like I think Paris, we had probably about 200 reported, and since then it's been around 130, 140 type of thing. So it's not a bad number. Christina, why don't I go to you, and then and then I'll go to Maya.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to phrase it, so just bear with me. I'm going to try and talk through this thought. I want to ask if this like your whole project, but maybe specifically if you want to focus on the sustainable self-determination part. I wanted to know if this is meant to work like within the settler colonial system, or is this something that would work outside in, like, let's say, like solely indigenous systems? Because I know there's like a lot of talks between, you know, can you use the colonizers' tools and things like that to actually reach true indigenous sovereignty and things like that. So I was just wondering if this is just a way to, I guess, put more seats at the settler colonial table, or is this a way to bring it to the indigenous table and then kind of just inviting maybe settlers to join that conversation? Yeah, sorry, if you need more clarification, feel free to ask back, but that's the general question I had.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really important question, and like appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, definitely. Like, so a few thoughts. Like, one, obviously, like that determination as to like whether, you know, we want to work within settler colonial frameworks or not is dependent on the individual First Nation. And in fact, like the way in which, you know, we think about sovereignty as a tangled web and self-determination as a web of relationships influences that, right? Just in the sense of, you know, our systems of decision making either directly or indirectly connect to the systems of decision making that territories, provinces, or the federal government has. And so really kind of understanding the ways in which those things are weaved together is really important. The intention of like sustainable self-determination, I think, is twofold. One is, you know, definitely like how are we ensuring that mainstream systems are essentially not, you know, directly combating and preventing indigenous expressions of self-determination? Like how are they, you know, kind of open to the reality of those two systems, the recognition that these systems, you know, could and do occur in parallel, and that, you know, we need those points of cross deliberation. And that's partly of what, you know, nation to nation kind of relationships acknowledges. But at the same time, like I think the concept of sustainable self-determination is like deeply linked to the ways in which indigenous peoples express their systems of self-determination. Like it's a recognition that, you know, and I think, you know, sometimes I got some questions about like why I like the concept of sustainable self-determination. Part of it is just because I think like, you know, even self-determining nations don't always make sustainable decisions, right? And so this is just a way to add another kind of longer term thinking that you know, we want to embed within, or we do embed within our practices of decision making. But it is deeply about like uplifting the ways in which we express our history, governance, and knowledge systems. And that can be done in a wide variety of different ways. Like that can be done through, you know, direct assertions of rights, whether, you know, through like land defense or water defense. It can be through, you know, leveraging a kind of agreements with the Crown to provide, you know, additional kind of governance and authority, or, you know, can be kind of working to delegate a responsibility. And so, you know, all of those different elements, I think I would characterize as like tools in the toolkit towards, you know, First Nations and Indigenous peoples expressing their self-determination.
Thank you.
Yeah, Miigwech. Maya?
Yeah, hi. So in one of my classes last year, we actually talked a little bit about nature-based solutions, but more focused on like the issues of them, specifically with how like large corporations will sort of engage with nature-based solutions, and such as like carbon offsetting, and, you know, they purchase an area in the rainforest in the Amazon or whatever, and displace indigenous people. But obviously, like you were saying in your presentation, nature-based solutions are very important, especially through an indigenous framework. So how do you know if like how indigenous people are sort of working towards that shift for nature-based solutions, focusing on an indigenous framework rather than this, you know, damaging
way from large corporations?
Yeah, really important question. And I'd say, like just within nature-based solutions, obviously there's like a wide diversity of what those solutions are. Obviously kind of offsetting, and the implication of offsetting, whether it's, land grabs or other kind of forms of climate colonialism are really bad. And then there are other, potentially good ones, like planting trees or planting mangroves, depending on how in which they work. So don't want to like provide a broad brush of the potential opportunities. On the Indigenous side, I think part of the importance of like unpacking these concepts are like that they aren't ours, but then they are being, to Carlos's point, like supported and almost co-opted to essentially articulate a solution that is in line with living reciprocally with the land around us. It's intended to essentially co-opt those frameworks of thinking into justifying how we define and think about these solutions. And nature-based as a solution in itself, like obviously could be a very good or constructive thing, but the way in which the relationship that you have with nature influences that. And so because it's not our concept, but because it's kind of getting all of this like press, whether academically or politically or philanthropically, there's a requirement to like essentially reclaim what that is and how do we think about it. And really, in my mind, that reclamation is just really a way to legitimize, under the kind of dominant eyes, the practices that Indigenous peoples are already engaging in. And that's why, the kind of practices of, clam gardens, for instance, is a practice that has been expressed for thousands and thousands of years. The way in which we cultivate food sovereignty and food security has been practiced for, thousands and thousands of years. The way in which we invest in language revitalization, cultural camps, etc., are kind of our expressions of what others would call kind of nature-based solutions. And so that like active reclamation of these concepts, in my mind, is really important, because otherwise we kind of reaffirm the path dependency that we see within these dominant discourses. And then it's used to legitimize exactly what you said. It's used to legitimize, essentially corporations and governments doing the exact same thing, but saying that they're offsetting, their emissions. It's like I think I call it like the side salad approach. It's like they're still manging on the big burger and just trying to pretend like offsetting it with salads is going to address the problem. And, that's partly why, in my mind, like a problem created by technology and markets isn't necessarily going to be solved by technology and markets. And that's kind of what we see in terms of the way in which, these systems are conceptualizing and thinking about these solutions. Yeah, that was a really great question.
Thank you.
And I think our last is Davina.
Hi, how are you?
Doing good.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation, and obviously good luck next week. So my question to you is, with the gains in UN recognition of Indigenous peoples, how do you think it actually fit within the context of current issues like what's going on in the Wet'suwet'en lands? Like, how do we address like different interpretation of Indigenous jurisdiction in order to make more space to implement like different frameworks like nature-based systems, especially within like a time-sensitive issues like the infrastructure building for extraction, like just more like what's happening right now. How can we create more space for solutions?
Yeah, no, really important question. And I think like, it's reminiscent of why Haudenosaunee leaders went to the UN to begin with, and the 40s and 50s and 60s was really the recognition that we identify and they identified as nations, and that engaging with the League of Nations was intended to address some of the inadequacies within how the Canadian government acknowledged our existence. And so I think that like continuation of, the way in which we express our nationhood, the way in which that relates to the conversations occurring on enhanced participation, within the UN General Assembly, enhanced participation for Indigenous peoples, are like constructive outputs for, if we're not getting that recognition within Canada, how do we do it at a, higher level? I would say like I'm a little bit probably more cynical than most in terms of the way in which like these UN bodies kind of interface with, national jurisdiction and political jurisdiction. And part of that is, because, for instance, in the context of Wet'suwet'en, we know that UBCIC and others applied for the CERD, like the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and the CERD responded quite positively to, the limitations and issues that Canada's response had against the land defenders there. And, effectively that's as far as it went, right? Like there's no ability to, enforce these sorts of decisions in national jurisdiction. That's not to say I don't think they're valuable, right? Like I think it is valuable in how Indigenous peoples use the variety of different tools that they have to A, ensure protection, and B, make sure that these systems are acknowledged. But I don't necessarily have like the same sort of belief in the UN system. Sorry. But I do think like, there are like a lot of other mechanisms that Indigenous peoples are engaging in, including direct action, including, what I'm hopeful that the implementation of the UN Declaration will lead to in, how we reorganize and rethink about the ways in which jurisdiction is expressed. And so even though it doesn't, necessarily get to the place where, I think it needs to be, it does, like you said, open up that space for these conversations to happen. And whether or not, those spaces are like implemented is a secondary question. I think we're even kind of missing, and the intention of my work, for instance, is like opening up that space so that we can have those conversations at a very deep level. And then based on those conversations, how do we move forward, which is equally important. So sorry, that was a little scattered, but I appreciate your question. And the final thing I'll say is there's a really great book by the current North American representative on the expert mechanism for the rights of Indigenous peoples, that kind of informs my thinking on this. Like it's called That Subtle Revolution by Cheryl Lightfoot. I think it's Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution or something. And it really just shows that kind of incrementalism that's implicit within, effectively the big bureaucracy in the sky, right? The bureaucracy of bureaucracies. And how that, slowly over time has been seeing an increase. And, where there are spaces to leverage that, Indigenous peoples have been, but, there are limitations to that.
Okay. Chimigwech for all of this, Graeme. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you there, Davina. But yeah, no, Chimigwech for this incredible talk, for sharing this like very high level, principled, extremely nuanced and strategic kind of analysis of nature-based solutions and of the work of Indigenous peoples to address the climate crisis on so many different levels as part of a larger project of decolonization. And for giving us, those of us who are non-Indigenous on the call, different ways of thinking about how we can situate ourselves also in relation to all of this. So again, Chimigwech, thank you to all of you for joining us, for sharing this time, and for your questions and for your attention. And with that, I'll say goodbye. But before I do, I also want to just say to the students of Indigenous Environmental Justice 4311, we're going to be meeting in 15 minutes. So at 1:45 on the Zoom link that I sent you guys through eClass. And not that you need luck on Monday, Graeme, but
I'll take it.
We'll all be thinking of you. Good vibes to Graeme for the dissertation defense.
Yeah, to everybody, and really appreciate your contributions.